The Huey was already coming in when the crew saw two answers to the same question. Smoke was rising from one place. Then smoke appeared somewhere else. Only one of those positions belonged to the Americans they were looking for. That was the problem. The crew had been told to look for yellow smoke. In Vietnam, that was a normal enough way to finish the last part of an approach. The helicopter gets close. The ground unit marks its position. The pilot sees the smoke, reads the wind, lines up the aircraft, and brings the ship toward the men who are waiting. Except this time, somebody else knew the color. Captain John Bishop, flying with the 174th Assault Helicopter Company, later remembered that North Vietnamese troops were listening to American radio traffic. They knew he was looking for yellow smoke to identify the landing zone. So, they gave him yellow smoke. That is not a complicated deception. That is what makes it so good. The enemy did not have to build a fake radio beacon. They did not have to steal a helicopter. They did not have to convince anybody that a whole village was friendly. They only had to know what one American pilot expected to see next. Yellow smoke. The crew saw it. And for a few seconds, something that normally simplified the approach made the approach less certain. Then came the correction. The real position was marked with pink smoke. Now the crew had two visual signals in front of them. One had arrived exactly the way the radio traffic suggested it would. The other was the correction that mattered. That is where I want to keep this story. Not on the idea that somebody almost fooled a pilot with a colored grenade. The more interesting part is what happens when a familiar procedure stops being proof. Because the Huey still has to land somewhere. The men on the ground still need the aircraft. The crew cannot hover over the entire area until everybody explains himself. And the farther down the approach they go, the fewer easy options they have left. A helicopter landing zone is not just a colored cloud. It is geometry. Where are the friendly troops? Where is the enemy? Which direction is the wind coming from? What obstacles are around the landing point? Where can the aircraft go if it has to break off? What will the crew be flying over on final? Smoke helps answer some of that. It does not answer all of it. Bishop's story is useful because it strips smoke down to what it really was. A clue. A very important clue. But still a clue. The ground unit might tell the aircraft what color to expect only when the helicopter was already close enough to see the smoke. That helped prevent an enemy listener from knowing the color too far in advance. In this case, according to Bishop's later account, the enemy had heard enough. They knew yellow was what he expected. That meant color alone could no longer settle the question. So the crew had to do what experienced crews did with almost everything in Vietnam. Make the pieces agree. The radio call has to fit the terrain. The terrain has to fit the unit's reported position. The smoke has to fit the radio call. The direction of enemy fire has to make sense. The approach path has to put the helicopter where friendly troops say it belongs. One clue can be wrong. Several clues pointing to the same place are harder to fake. That sounds obvious when we talk about it now. It is different when the aircraft is moving. A Huey on approach is not a conference room. The pilot is flying. The co-pilot is watching instruments and terrain. The crew chief and gunner are looking outside. The radio is active. The ground may be broken into small fields, tree lines, paddies, villages, ridges, or patches of jungle that look similar from the air. The smoke itself is moving with the wind. The aircraft is descending. And every second spent deciding is another second spent near the place where enemy rifles can reach the helicopter. That is why which smoke becomes a real problem so quickly. The easiest answer is to trust the color. That answer has just failed. The next answer is to trust the voice on the radio. But that only helps if the voice and the ground match. American helicopter crews learned to ask ground units for information that could not be supplied by a smoke grenade alone. Where are you in relation to a road? Which side of the tree line? Where is the enemy from your position? What direction is the fire coming from? What will I see if I continue another few hundred meters? Those questions turn the ground unit into part of the navigation system. The pilot does not need a speech. He needs one detail that separates the right patch of Earth from the wrong one. The official doctrine sounds tidy when written down. Mark the landing zone. Communicate. Confirm friendly location. Land into the wind when possible. Avoid enemy positions. Provide security. The men doing it did not experience those items as separate paragraphs. They experienced them all at once. And sometimes, one of those pieces contradicted another. John Bishop's yellow smoke did exactly that. The color said one thing. The rest of the situation had to say something else. That is where the crew earns its decision. Not because the pilot has some magical ability to look down and recognize Americans from 1,000 feet. Because somebody notices that the story does not fit. A smoke signal that is correct, but comes from the wrong place, is still wrong. A landing zone that looks easier, but puts the aircraft over the reported enemy, is still wrong. A voice that says, "Come on in," is not enough if the terrain underneath does not match what the unit has been describing. This is the part of helicopter war that is easy to miss. Pilots were not only moving aircraft, they were constantly deciding what information deserved weight. And the information came from people who were working under their own pressure. A platoon leader on the ground might be talking while his men were in contact. An RTO might be passing coordinates while moving. A company commander might be trying to get wounded men out. The pilot might hear only a few words before another transmission steps on the net. Then, smoke goes up. That colored cloud can feel like the first clean answer anybody has provided in 30 seconds. Which is exactly why an enemy who understands the procedure has something useful to imitate. The clever part is not the smoke grenade. The clever part is knowing when smoke matters. Bishop said the North Vietnamese were listening on American radio frequencies. That detail turns the episode into something larger than one false marker. The enemy did not need to guess what the Huey crew was doing. They could hear enough of the process to know what the crew would look for next. Once that happens, a procedure becomes predictable, and anything predictable can be copied. That does not make the procedure useless. It changes how much trust you put in one part of it. This is the midpoint. At first, the question is simple. Which smoke is friendly? Then the question changes. What happens when the enemy knows how we answer that question? That is a much harder problem. Because now, you cannot fix it by choosing a new color once. If the enemy can listen, he can learn the new color too. If he can watch helicopter operations, he can learn how long after the radio call the smoke usually appears. If he watches where aircraft land, he can learn what a friendly pickup zone tends to look like. If he knows the Americans usually mark the wind with smoke, he can use that familiar behavior against them. The answer has to be more than secrecy. It has to be confirmation. There is a reason helicopter crews sometimes waited until the aircraft was close before asking for smoke. You want the marker to solve the last piece of the approach, not announce the landing zone to everybody 10 miles away. And there is another reason the aircrew might ask the ground unit to pop smoke without naming a color first. Let the ground unit throw it. Then, the crew identifies the color it sees. If the pilot says, "I have green smoke," and the ground unit answers, "Negative, ours is red," the mismatch matters immediately. That small procedural habit takes the color away from anybody listening who does not already know which smoke is friendly. It does not make deception impossible. Nothing did, but it forces the enemy to work harder. That is what most good field procedures do. They do not remove uncertainty. They make uncertainty more expensive for the other side. The 174th Assault Helicopter Company was flying the kind of missions where those little distinctions mattered all the time. Troop lifts, resupply, command and control, emergency movements, landings in places that might be secure when the flight took off, and hot by the time the Hueys arrived. A helicopter crew could be told an LZ was safe and still be taking fire on short final. They could be given coordinates that looked clean on a map and find trees, wires, dikes, or enemy positions when they arrived. They could be looking for smoke from a unit that had moved 50 meters because somebody started shooting at them. No procedure survives contact with the ground unchanged. That is why crews built judgment around procedure instead of replacing judgment with procedure. There is a first-hand account from another Vietnam helicopter pilot that shows the normal version of this. He was flying emergency ammunition to infantrymen who were heavily engaged. Before landing, he contacted the ground commander. He learned where the friendly troops were. He learned where the enemy fire was coming from. Then, smoke was popped. The smoke told him something immediately useful. It showed the wind. It also showed that he could make the landing without overflying the enemy position. That is exactly what smoke was supposed to do. One colored cloud helped the pilot combine wind, friendly location, enemy location, and approach direction into a landing plan. Now put Bishop's false yellow smoke beside that. Same object, completely different value. In one case, smoke confirms the picture. In the other, smoke contaminates it. The difference is not the grenade. The difference is whether the smoke agrees with everything else. That is the practical heart of this episode. If you flew helicopters in Vietnam, or if you were on the ground bringing them into LZs, I would like to know how your unit handled smoke identification. Did the aircraft call the color after you popped it? Did the ground unit announce the color first? Did procedures change after the enemy started listening? And if you remember a time when somebody popped the wrong smoke, or more than one smoke appeared, put the unit and year in the comments. Those details are not trivia. They are how crews actually kept procedures useful after the enemy learned the procedure. The crew chief had a role in that too. From the back of a Huey, the world can look different than it does from the pilot's seat. The crew chief may see troops, the pilots do not. The gunner may catch muzzle flashes off to one side. A man standing up and waving near the real LZ can matter. A panel on the ground can matter. The direction everybody is facing can matter. The absence of people where the smoke appeared can matter. This is one reason helicopter crews were crews. The pilots were flying the aircraft. The men in the back were helping build the picture. Nobody had every angle. And in a situation with two smoke signals, every extra angle becomes valuable. Imagine the approach again. One column of yellow smoke, then a second marker. The radio says correction. Now the crew is not asking whether smoke is useful. It is asking which piece of smoke belongs to the rest of the evidence. That means the ground unit has to prove its location with more than color. The pilot has to compare the reported position to what he sees. The crew has to check whether the approach path makes sense. If the enemy is reported east of the friendlies, and the yellow smoke would put the Huey directly over that area, that is not a small detail. It changes the approach. If the corrected smoke is next to the tree line the ground unit has been describing, now the picture begins to close. If a guide is visible, if friendly troops are oriented outward from that spot, if the radio caller can describe the aircraft's position from the ground, each match removes one more bad possibility. This is not dramatic in the movie sense. Nobody needs to shout that it is a trap. The crew simply stops treating the first answer as enough. That is a more mature kind of tension. The aircraft is still moving toward a decision. The men below are still waiting. But certainty is being rebuilt one piece at a time. There is also a quiet difference between identifying a landing zone from a map and identifying it from a cockpit. On the map, the coordinate is still. In the aircraft, the ground is sliding underneath you. A road that looked like a perfect reference from 5 miles out can disappear behind trees. A bend in a river can look like the next bend. A small clearing can hide until the last turn. The smoke is supposed to tie the map to the real place. That is why a false marker is so effective psychologically. It arrives exactly at the moment when the crew wants to stop comparing possibilities. They have already navigated most of the way. They have already found the general area. They have already talked to the unit. Now they want the final confirmation. Smoke says, "Stop searching. This is it. The false yellow smoke in Bishop's account attacked that final step. Not navigation in general. Commitment. And once a helicopter commits to short final, backing out becomes a different maneuver than simply waiting another few seconds at altitude. That is why the crew has to spend its doubt early, before the skids are close to the ground, before the aircraft is slow and exposed, before a convenient patch of smoke becomes the only thing anybody is looking at. A careful crew does not wait until the last 50 feet to decide whether the entire picture makes sense. It builds confidence on the way in. Then, the smoke confirms what is already mostly understood. When the smoke contradicts that picture, the contradiction is the information. There is something else about smoke that veterans will understand better than anybody watching on a screen. Smoke does not stay where you put it. Wind pulls it. Rotor wash attacks it. Vegetation can hide the base of the cloud. A grenade can land on one side of a dike and make the apparent center of the smoke look different from the actual position. The color itself can look less obvious through haze, dust, late daylight, or distance. So even friendly smoke was never a perfect pin on a digital map. It was a physical thing in moving air. That matters in Bishop's story, because once there are two signals, the crew cannot simply compare two neat dots. They are looking at two pieces of smoke that are both changing shape. One may be in better terrain. One may look more obvious. One may appear closer to the expected coordinates. One may even offer the easier landing. And the easiest landing is not automatically the friendly one. That is where experience fights instinct. A pilot naturally wants a safe approach, good wind, clear obstacles, enough room, a clean departure path. If the false smoke is in the better piece of ground, the deception gets stronger. The pilot has to be willing to reject the attractive answer because the information behind it does not fit. I do not have evidence that Bishop's false marker was placed in the better LZ, so I am not saying it was. The point is what the crew had to protect against. A marker tells you where someone wants you to look. It does not tell you who that someone is. That idea was not limited to smoke. Vietnam was full of signals whose value depended on context. Radio calls, panels, flares, flashlights, aircraft recognition signals, call signs, even familiar voices. The enemy watched. The enemy listened. American troops changed procedures. Then, the enemy learned again. That back and forth is what makes battlefield identification so much more interesting than a list of rules. A rule works until the other side understands why it works. Then, the rule needs another layer. Smoke plus radio. Radio plus terrain. Terrain plus friendly orientation. Friendly orientation plus timing. The answer is not one perfect signal. It is agreement among imperfect signals. By the time Bishop's crew corrected away from the yellow marker and toward the pink smoke, the most important thing had already happened. The yellow smoke had lost its authority. It was still visible. It was still the color the pilot had expected. It was still sitting on the ground like an answer, but it was no longer proof. That is a very strange moment for any crew. The object has not changed. Its meaning has. A minute earlier, yellow smoke meant, there they are. Now yellow smoke means, check everything. That is the kind of change Walter Briggs stories are built around. Not a bigger explosion. A familiar thing becoming unreliable. And once that happens, the crew cannot go back to the old version of the procedure. The next time smoke appears, the memory is there. Do not land on color alone. Make the picture agree. If you like these Vietnam stories because they stay with the men doing the work, the pilot, the crew chief, the RTO, the people on the ground trying to make one small decision correctly, subscribe. A lot of the most important moments in this war happened before anybody fired. Sometimes the whole difference was whether a crew trusted the first thing it saw. John Bishop's story ends with something almost embarrassingly small. Not a dogfight, not a helicopter crash, not a famous battle. Two colors, yellow and pink. One smoke marker had been produced because the enemy knew what the Americans expected. The other belonged to the men the Huey had actually come to find. The helicopter still had to choose. That is what makes the image stay with you. 2 columns of smoke, 1 aircraft, a few seconds to make the picture fit. And after that day, a familiar color in Vietnam could never be quite as simple as it had been before.